Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this sword named Chasm. And I will start off the review by posing a question. What would a European katana look like? As I go through this review, this could be the answer. So this sword was designed by my friend Nate, also known as the Levin Lance or perhaps Brother Nathaniel. He has designed a whole host of different weapons, primarily swords, but some other stuff in there, and it's all kind of in support of his fictitious fantasy setting and all centered around the Lodge. If you want to know more about this, there's quite a bit of lore involved. I'm going to link a video up here to a review by Kane Shen, who talked quite a bit about the fiction that Nate has developed. To give you just a little taste, here is some lore about Chasm specifically. Blended design elements of the mysterious East and the Lodge's martial fanaticism gave way to ghastly weaponry that many felt was a challenge against mercy. They weren't wholly wrong, for we have witnessed the fantastic beasts halved and divided. No matter of flesh and bone can rectify the chasm between them and the Father. In addition, the Levin Lance is currently working with 616 Games to create the lore for a short video game. For more about 616 Games, check out the link in the description. Now, this is not my sword. It belongs to Nate, and when I'm done with the review, I'm going to send it back to him. If you want to commission something pretty similar, I think the price range would be right around $900 to $1,000. I don't have an exact amount for you. It was made by Purna Darnall. Nate has commissioned Purna to make a lot of his weapons. If you're not familiar with Purna, he is a kukri smith in Nepal and is the owner and primary smith of Great Gurkha Kukri. I'll put a link in the description to his webpage. Now, being a kukri smith, that's what he knows. Traditional Nepalese weapons such as kukris. But he does take commissions on a whole host of different swords, and a lot of people like to take advantage of his willingness to try to make pretty much anything to make fantasy swords, and ones that you won't really see available in the production market. Now, because Purna is a kukri smith, not really a swordsmith, he is not familiar necessarily with the intricacies of European-inspired swords, Japanese-inspired swords, anything like that. He's familiar with Nepalese weapons. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't understand concepts such as distal taper, but he's not going to have the intimate knowledge of how to make a sword into the handle correctly. So if you're interested in commissioning something from Purna that is outside of his wheelhouse, you really do need to have very good detailed specs and a good drawing of what you want to be made so that he can understand how it should work, what the measurements should be, and all that kind of thing. So let's talk about what type of sword this is. Now, this is obviously a fantasy sword, but that doesn't mean it's not based on any kind of historical trends or anything like that. In fact, one of the primary inspirations for it is this specific two-handed falchion that was designed by James Elmsley, kind of the guru when it comes to historical falchions. And he designed that two-handed falchion for the 2012 video game War of the Roses. As far as I'm aware, nobody has taken that drawing and turned it into a physical sword. I could be mistaken though. I don't know every sword out there, that's for sure. Now, Angus Trim does have a model of French medieval falchion that he has, I believe, both a one-handed and two-handed. That takes a great deal of inspiration from that drawing as well, from what I understand. And the other big inspiration for this sword is a katana. And let me explain that, because, just looking at this, it doesn't say anything like katana. You need to take a little bit closer look. First off, it's a pretty short blade at just over 30 inches, kind of like a katana. Most of them are 28, 29, 27 inches, around that area. So 30 inches is a bit long for a katana, but not crazy long. It starts very thick here at the crossguard at 7.5 millimeters thick and stays relatively thick throughout much of the blade. Again, a lot like a katana. And it's also usable one or two-handed. Now, there's more things here that show the inspiration, and I will get into them during that part of the video. Now, historically speaking, as far as I'm aware, there are no existing artifacts of two-handed falchions. There is artwork depicting them, and there are swords that I would consider kind of the descendant of the falchion, the Swiss saber, Kriegsmesser, that there's existing examples of, but none that are specifically falchions. Now, falchions were primarily cutting-focused swords. There's this misconception in Hollywood and just in general pop culture that falchions are anti-armor heavy choppers, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Falchions are very much focused on cutting and slicing. They tend to get very thin out towards the foible, and they're going to be effective against bare flesh, against softer targets, maybe against gambesons, that kind of thing. They are going to be almost completely useless against any kind of harder armor, such as chain or plate. They're just not going to be effective. Those types of armor are incredibly good at stopping cuts. And aside from getting pretty thin out at the foible, they also tend to start pretty thin here at the crossguard. We're talking around 4 to 5 millimeters. There's obviously variation, but generally speaking, not that thick at the crossguard. No, Shadiversity, they are not comparable to a machete, which often starts at around 2 millimeters thick. I know Shad has put out a correction video on that. I just wanted to add in my 2 cents on that. And this sword and the Elmsley designed one for the video game, I believe were inspired by the Elmsley Type F3E, which is very unique with this double scallop in the spine. Now, those historically, I asked Mr. Elmsley what their thickness would be, and he said probably around 4.5 to 5.5 millimeters at the crossguard, down to about 2.5 millimeters out near, getting close to the tip. So this is a little bit different. Like I said, it starts out at 7.5 millimeters, but that's okay because this is not trying to be an F3E falchion. It's going for its own thing. It's its own design. The Levin Lance really does like swords that start quite thick and have a good amount of distal taper. And if it works, that's what matters, right? So it's not a historical design, but it's not trying to be a historical design. It's a fantasy sword that takes a lot of concepts from historical swords and then modifies them to make the sword that the Levin Lance wanted. So taking a look at the scabbard here, this is a wood core scabbard with a leather wrap, and it's quite similar to Perna's kukri scabbards. It's got the same kind of look and feel. The leather feels pretty much the same. The decorations here towards the tip and up here at the throat are all very reminiscent of Perna's kukri scabbards. The black dye is a little shinier than I'm used to, and it actually has little bits that look shinier when looked at in sunlight, and it gives it a little bit more depth to the design. As for the fit, it's pretty rough. When the sword is in all the way, it rattles quite a bit, and if I hold it upside down, it falls right out. Now, part of that is due to the design of the sword. These scallops on the back make for a challenging fit for the scabbard, and in fact, when you're inserting the sword into the scabbard, it can actually be pretty easy for the point to get caught in one of these scallops, as I demonstrate here. Personally, I would prefer a bit more retention in the scabbard, and that could be done by beefing up the material here in the throat just a little bit so that it creates a snugger fit. This is very similar to how a katana's habaki slides into the saya, and that's the primary retention piece. It could be improved, but it's not personally to me a big deal that it's not. Let's take a close look at the hilt, starting with the pommel. So this is an octagonal shape, which is kind of similar to an Oakshott Type I1. It's made of steel and has been blackened. The blackening is a little uneven, a little rough, but not too bad. And there's this absolutely beautiful inlay in brass of roses in a cross shape. These are very common themes in the Levin Lance's designs. He loves crosses and roses, and it looks phenomenal here. I think Perna especially really nailed the inlay here. The pommel could stand to have a little bit more depth to the design. It could use to start a little bit thicker here at the grip and taper down a little bit towards the peen. That's something you see on most historical pommels. You'll see it on the high-end replicas. It would be nice to see it here. The peen is nicely rounded and finished a little rough, and there's a few errant hammer marks visible both on it and the pommel. Not a big deal, because especially if you're interested in Perna's work, his stuff always has a very handmade aesthetic. So if little imperfections like that are going to bother you, Perna is not the right person to make your sword. All of the corners on the pommel have been superbly chamfered. There's not a single spot that could be considered a hot spot. And when I'm using this sword, I very much tend to grip the pommel in my offhand, and I have never once had the slightest bit of discomfort for it. So that attention to detail in chamfering all this is very good and very well done. The grip is your traditional wood core leather wrap with a cord texture on it, and it has this quite prominent riser here in the middle, and this is very obviously inspired by the famous Brescia Spadona, and I really like how it's done here. It's very crisp and very well defined. The shape of the grip is overall pretty good. It's wider than it is thick in all dimensions, which is good. However, it's a bit odd in that it starts a little narrower here, swells out towards the center, and then narrows here a bit more. It's just a little bit different. I'm used to grips that are a little bit wider here and kind of taper down towards the pommel. It's not an ineffective shape. It works. It's just not quite what I'm used to. In addition, it's just a little bit thicker than I would prefer. These are very minor nitpicks here, and they're really not even nitpicks. They're just my preference. The seam in the leather is stitched, and the stitching, while definitely tactilely noticeable, is not sharp or doesn't have a hot spot except at the knots on both ends, which are just a tiny bit rough and uncomfortable. They can catch your fingers a little bit. The guard doesn't really conform to any of your typical Oakshott type guards. It's probably closest to a Type 2, but really only superficially. There's quite a bit of dimension here. It starts pretty thick here, transitions into an octagonal shape, and then flares back out at the tips of the quillins. You've got these kind of risers almost on both sides, and if you look at the tips of the quillins, there's actually a brass inlaid cross on both of them, which is just a really great touch. You almost never see decoration at the tips of the quillins like that, and it's a good idea, I think. I really like that little extra touch. Just like the pommel, the steel is blackened, although it's a little bit rougher and blotchier than the blackening on the pommel. Again, not really a problem, just a little uneven. The gap where the blade meets the guard is very small, but I think that's because of the way this is constructed. I don't think the shoulders of the blade rest in a slot in the crossguard. I think they're resting right up against the crossguard. That's something that I would like to see improved. Overall, the shaping of the crossguard is quite good. There's absolutely no hot spots anywhere. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the blade is 30 3/8 inches long. It's balanced at 4 inches, and overall it weighs just a hair under 3 pounds. As I mentioned earlier, it starts at 7.5 millimeters thick with some complex distal taper. It quickly narrows down to 6 millimeters thick after just 6 inches, then very gradually tapers down about 0.5 millimeter for the next 12 inches, before accelerating down to 2.9 millimeters at 30 inches up the blade. However, the thickness is a little inconsistent, as the center of percussion, 19.25 inches up, is a little bit thicker at 5.8 millimeters than at the 18-inch mark, where I measured it at 5.5 millimeters. Now, one of the most common design threads through a lot of the Levin Lance's work, whether it be swords or knives or whatever, is this choil that you have here. The choil is much more common on modern design knives than you'll see on historical swords, but that's one of the things that the Levin Lance likes. Now, theoretically, you could use this to help you finger the guard and keep your index finger kind of rest in the choil. However, this one's just a little bit shallow, and the corner where it meets the actual blade is a little acute, so it's kind of can bite the finger, and the blade is extremely sharp right up there. So probably not the best idea to put your finger there. One of the other common themes on the Levin Lance's designs is the plunge grind here that meets the choil. Again, something that you see much more often on modern knives than on historical swords. But again, more of an aesthetic choice than any kind of functionality thing. The sword is finished in a pretty rough satin with a lot of errant grind marks and scratches from polishing. This is very typical for Perna's work. The fuller is even rougher finish here, and honestly, it could use to be polished up a bit more. There's definitely some rippling in the blade, more than I would like at this price point, but it is what it is. I personally would like to see a little bit less rippling. Now, this is going to sound a little crazy, but let me explain. This blade reminds me a lot of an Unokubi Zukuri katana. So you look at this and you're like, what are you talking about, Kyle? That's insane. Well, let me explain. Like I said, it starts very thick here, and this portion right here is about a third of the length of the blade, and this is where the spine is very thick. Just like an Unokubi that starts very thick, and for the first third of the blade or so stays about that thick. And then the spine dramatically clips in to kind of like almost like a false edge, but not a false edge. And there's now a ridge right down the length where the primary bevel starts. On a katana, this is a Shinogi G. Well, this one, the chasm, kind of has that also, with the thickest part of the blade being right here, and then that's the primary bevel. In addition, there's a fuller that runs the length of that extra thick spine, just like on Unokubi Zukuri. Now, here's something that I'm pretty confident you won't notice until I point it out. This sword actually has a very subtle hamon to it. So it's actually differentially hardened. In the right light, you can see a very subtle line where the hardness is different. Now, I don't think Perna uses clay like you would see on a traditionally differentially hardened katana. I'm guessing he did some kind of an edge quench here. I don't know the details, but I do see that hamon there. It's certainly not as bright and flamboyant as even the most simple hamon on a katana, but it is there, and I do think it just helps bring that idea of a European katana a bit more to life. And unfortunately, this brings me to what is without a doubt the biggest problem with this sword. And honestly, it's not really with this sword. It's a little bit, but to explain, after seeing this sword posted on a few Facebook groups, noted swordsman Philip Martin contacted Nate asking him if he minded if Philip commissioned a very similar sword from Perna. Nate gave him permission, and Philip kind of added his own tweaks to it. He made the blade, I believe, about 4 inches longer. I don't think he did the inlay on it, but very similar swords. Well, when Philip received the sword, he did a little bit of flex testing with it, and it took a set. And he contacted Perna about it, and Perna made him a second one. That one took even more of a set because it was soft. He could bend it very easily. And he sent me this video showing the two different swords bending and taking a set. I apologize for the quality of this video. Facebook does terrible things to video compression. But you can see Philip bending his, and here I also have a video of me doing the similar test with Chasm. So if you look here, you can see that Chasm doesn't bend as much as those. I think what's going on there is the extra 4-inch length on Phillips means it gets a little bit thinner. It's going to be a bit more flexible. But Chasm did take a set as well. Not nearly as much as Phillips' two swords, but it did take a very slight set. This set was small enough that I wasn't really able to capture it on camera. So what's going on here? Well, this is probably going to be a bit rambly, but here's my thoughts on the matter. First off, Chasm at least is differentially hardened. Phillips are not. He shared a video that Perna shared of him quenching the sword, and it was very obviously not differentially hardened. But Chasm seems to be. On a differentially hardened sword, just like on a katana, when you do flexing, they are far more likely to take a set than a through hardened sword, which is generally speaking a spring steel sword. So I think on Chasm, the set it took is completely within the bounds of reasonableness for this type of sword. It was basically a very slight bend in the spine, a little bit. I got it almost completely out just by bending it the other way pretty gently, but I didn't want to go ham on the sword to try to really get it set, because I don't want to end up creating like S curves in the spine if I'm not exactly right with the where I'm bending it. So, like I said, I don't think this is a problem on Chasm. This is kind of to be expected on a differentially hardened sword. Back to Phillips though. Those were not differentially hardened. Those are supposed to be through hardened, and they should not be taking a set like that. They shouldn't be that easy to bend and take a set either, especially the second one. So what's going on here? Well, Perna clearly knows how to heat treat. You know, my Heron Mark sword that he made doesn't take a set at all. He's done kukris, he's done a lot of work, and a lot of swords that don't take sets. I don't know exactly what's going on here. Now, when Philip got the second one, he again contacted Perna and said, hey, this one's worse, it's softer, it's not done right. And Perna said that the steel he used, he's had problems before. He offered to make a third one, and if that one doesn't work, he will offer a refund. This, in my opinion, is an awful response by Perna. First off, if you're making a second sword for somebody after the first one was not properly heat treated, why on earth would you use steel that you know is problematic, if that's actually true? And why would you not test the heat treat and make sure it returns to true? You're making an entire second sword, you're wiping out your profit margin by doing so, and then not testing it? That's insanity. Second, what do you mean a refund will be on the table only after a third attempt? Honestly, a refund should pretty much always be on the table if your sword does not perform the way it's supposed to. So honestly, after Philip received the first one and it was bad, Perna should at least acknowledge the possibility of a refund. I agree that, get a second one, make it, and, give him a second chance. That makes sense to me. After the second one, there should be no doubt that if Philip wants a refund, he should get one. So this hurts me to say because I like Perna. I like his work. I like interacting with him. I want him to succeed. But Philip's swords, especially the second one, is a dramatically bad failing. And if you can't trust a smith to nail the heat treat, why would you send him your money? So that's enough of that for right now. I'm going to talk about it some more later on. But let's move on to something that Perna has historically been very good at, and that's sharpening. So as I mentioned before, there's one smooth bevel from the thickest part of the blade all the way down to the edge, and there's some apple seeding here, although it's not quite as apple seeded as Perna usually does. He usually has pretty robust apple seeding on the swords, and this one is pretty thin here. If it were a European katana, we would say there's pretty much no Niku here at all. So let's move on to some cutting. And I did my normal targets with this sword: tatami, pool noodle, and water bottles. Let's start with tatami. You might have seen this footage already if you watch all the videos on my channel, as I featured it in my video about my new cutting stand. But this sword cuts tatami very well. Even when I slip and lose my footing somewhat on the loose rocks, cutting in this spot was a horrible idea. I won't be doing it again. I will say that if I cut out a little bit more towards the tip, that it's less effective at cutting. And that kind of makes sense because it starts getting a little bit narrower there in the blade, so there's not as much of a chance for the blade to get as thin as gently. Now, I'm not surprised that this sword cuts tatami well. It has good geometry and good sharpness, so that's going to typically make for a very effective tatami cutter. What did surprise me is how poor it was at cutting a pool noodle. I was only able to get one cut all the way through. Almost every other cut, I either just batted the noodle aside or it cut about halfway through and then just didn't make it all the way through. I'm not really sure why that is. It surprised me because the sword is very sharp, which usually is the number one requirement for good cuts on pool noodles. But for whatever reason, it just didn't cut pool noodles well. Now, water bottles I did a lot of cutting with, and this sword is very good at cutting water bottles. It's a lot of fun to use. I got a good number of silent cuts with it. It's very easy to move around and cut one or two-handed. Although just like the tatami, I did notice if I ended up cutting out a little past the center of percussion out closer to the tip, it didn't cut nearly as well. But that just means I need to adjust and make sure I'm cutting where it's most effective. I also did some water bottle cutting with an old t-shirt draped over the target. And I did this just to add an extra layer of toughness to the target because cloth is actually harder to cut than you might realize. You know, even just this t-shirt, which is 2 layers, you know, the front and back of the shirt, that alone is enough to make it a considerably harder target to cut. And on this 2-liter bottle that I'm cutting here, it wasn't a great cut. You know, I kind of ended up bashing the bottle a decent amount, but it did cut all the way through the cloth, all the way through both ends of the bottle, and deep into the cloth again before everything just kind of fell over. So that's a very successful cut. So let's talk about handling and compare this sword to a couple others. First off, here is the Weapon Dynamics computer graphic for this sword. And check the description for a link to the information for this. And it's important to note that the way I measured this sword basically has my offhand all the way gripping, pretty much all the way down to the pommel, because this is typically the way I grip this sword, because it's a relatively short grip. And, you know, I tend to kind of spread my hands out. I don't do a hammer grip, really. I try to go like this. This feels a lot more natural. I'm not sure exactly if this would be saber grip. I don't know all the details, but that tends to be how I use the sword in 2 hands. So that's the way I measured it, so that the graphic will represent how this sword handles for me. And this sword weighs in right at 3 pounds, just barely under it, and is balanced right around 4 inches past the crossguard, which leads to a sword that, with pretty short blade, it's a 30-inch blade, which is pretty short for a sword that you would consider a hand and a half, not abnormally short, on the short side. But with that much weight, it has heft to it. It has presence, but it's not tip heavy. You know, when I move it out here like this, I don't feel like the tip is dragging the sword. Some swords, if they have a lot of weight out here, when you move it out, it feels like it wants to do that. You know, it feels like this tip is dragging the entire sword forward. This doesn't feel like that at all. One-handed and then two-handed, it feels very good like this. I can just move it out here without any issues at all. And I have good tip control. I can move it around here and pretty much keep the tip mostly in the same place. I can redirect my cuts. It doesn't have any kind of wobble to it, which is a little bit interesting for a falchion actually, because a lot of falchions get very thin out near the foible. And therefore, generally speaking, when you have a thin blade, especially when you have a thin, wide blade, they're going to be a lot more flexible. They might have a little bit of wiggle to them when they're held out. This one is a little bit of a different design in that it is still not thick, but relatively thick out here until it gets like right around pretty much to the transition to the tip where it really starts getting thinner. So it's still quite stiff, which should help, I would imagine, in thrusting. Although with the point being a little bit upswept here, that's going to reduce the thrusting power a little bit. I think with the sharpness you see on this sword, I think it'll still be a pretty good thruster. But it moves around really well. Like I said, I can move it around one-handed. I definitely feel the heft. At 3 pounds, this is not a light one-handed sword, that's for sure. But it is usable in one hand. 2 hands, it feels great to move around. I really enjoy being able to redirect my motion, continue the motion. You know, I can stop the cut without it feeling like it's dragging on my wrists and my arm, anything like that. So overall, this sword is a lot of fun to move around and handle and swing. So of the swords in my collection, probably the most obvious one to do a comparison with would be my Herrenmark sword, also made by Pernod Darnall. Now, mine was designed kind of as a fantasy falchion, kind of inspired by a Swiss saber. It's got a much more complex hilt, although still not incredibly complex. But one of the things that does is that brings more weight back towards the hilt compared to the Chasm here. I don't know if you'll be able to see here, but the Chasm definitely stays thicker considerably more than my Herrenmark sword. I'm going to put the Chasm down for a moment just to illustrate a few things. So the point of balance on the Herrenmark, it actually is further out than Chasm. And that's because it's a longer blade, I think, because this is a 33-inch blade, if I remember right. So it actually, even with all this extra hilt furniture, it actually, with a longer blade, it balances out further. Part of that also is this is a pretty small pommel compared to the Chasm. So it's a much lighter weight pommel. But when I move this around, this one is also very nimble, very easy to move around. And I really enjoy owning this sword, so I do like it a lot. Let me pick up Chasm again. Yeah, this one, it not only does the point of balance feel a little closer, it feels heftier right in this area, which makes sense. This is a very thick blade right there, and it feels a little more nimble, not a lot, but a little more nimble. One of the kind of interesting things I find with this sword, though, is that because it is relatively short, I sometimes get out of measure with it, where I'll end up cutting with it more like right around here into this area, rather than back here where I really want to cut with it, because I'm tricked by the kind of shorter length of the sword. I really need to make sure I get a little bit closer to my target than I am expecting I need to, because it's a little shorter than I expect. So another sword I should compare this to is a katana. I've done a lot of talking in this review about how Chasm is similar to a katana in some ways. So here we have a Zisei katana that does not have a bohei. And I chose this one to compare it to because it doesn't have that bohei, so it's going to be one of the heavier katanas I have. Now this is only around 2.5 pounds, this is almost 3 pounds. So it's not a direct comparison. It's not an exact similar blade, but it's probably the closest I have in my possession right now. If you look, the Zisei is definitely a little bit of a shorter blade, although not a huge amount. And one of the primary differences I mentioned earlier is how much longer most hilts are on a katana. And this is about an inch to 1.5 inches difference, maybe 2 inches, if we're including the pommel entirely on the Chasm, which it does work as part of the grip. I can grip the pommel no problem. So that basically adds almost 2 inches to the length of the grip in a way on the Chasm, which brings it a lot closer to a katana length grip. I'm going to put the Chasm down here for a moment and just move the katana around. Yeah, it's not going to be that good of a comparison. This sword is notably lighter. I move it, pick it up, I move it around. It feels so much lighter than Chasm. It's not to say Chasm feels heavy or unwieldy. It's just this is notably lighter. And, it's 2 pounds, 7 ounces if I remember right. So Chasm is just a hair under 3 pounds. So we're talking 9 ounces here. That's a big difference. So this really is not going to feel similar at all. It's going to be considerably nimbler, feel a lot lighter, although the point of balance is actually even further out, I think, than on my Herrenmark. It looks like that's about 5 to 5.5 inches. So even with that, this does feel nimbler. And that's, 9 ounces is a big difference in weight. So this isn't really a great comparison. I don't really have a katana that is nearing 3 pounds. So it's not really something I can do a really good handling comparison on. But that doesn't mean that this doesn't resemble a katana in many ways. I was talking about the shorter blade length, meaning it sometimes tricks me into cutting more farther out than you really want to on this sword. And I sometimes have that problem with katana as well, that my favorite sword blades to use are long swords. They will tend to have 33, 36 inch blades, longer swords, hence the name, I would guess. And when I have one that's 30 inches, katana a lot, or 28 inches, it's not quite as natural to me where I need to stand to land a cut in the correct part of the blade. And, this one kind of fools me a little bit on that. Let's talk about some potential improvements for the sword, and I'm going to break it into two parts. First, design improvements for the Levin Lance, and second, making improvements for Purna. And I think this is appropriate since the design is by one person and the making is by another. So, design improvements. My biggest complaint, if you want to call it that, it's not much of a complaint, is I think the grip could be a little bit thinner, could have a little bit different shaping with a little bit wider here, tapering down like that. Second, the pommel. Again, very minor thing. I would like to see it a little bit thicker and taper out towards the peen. And lastly, and this is purely aesthetics here, I'm not a big fan of the choil and the plunge grind. I would prefer to see it straight through, like a typical medieval falchion. Now, as for the making improvements for Purna, well, it's obvious. The first one, consistent heat treatment. And, again, that's not really a problem on this sword. This one seems to be, generally speaking, pretty correctly heat treated. The slight bend that it took in the spine, I don't consider to be a problem because it's differentially hardened. But the two that Philip received, completely unacceptable, especially the second one. So consistent heat treat is probably the most important thing a bladesmith can do. If you can't consistently heat treat your swords properly, you're not making functional swords. So it's the most important thing, and it's something Purna needs to figure out. And just some wild speculation here, but I saw a video of Purna quenching one of Philip's swords, and while I am not at all an expert on heat treating, to me, from what little bits I've seen, it looked decent. Not perfect, but decent. So I don't understand why it would be soft. My thinking based on that is that it wasn't a heat treat problem, but it might have been a tempering problem. If Purna ended up tempering the sword after heat treating it at too high of a temperature for too long, it might have leached too much of the hardness out of the sword, resulting in it being soft. It's something that I can't really say because I don't have the behind the scenes knowledge. I don't have the expertise in metallurgy and heat treatment. I am a complete amateur here. Most of my knowledge here is coming from little bits gathered across the internet, from watching Forged in Fire, which I'm not going to get into that. And, so this is just wild speculation on my part, but it seems logical to me. Now, something else that Purna could do to improve is just up the finish a little bit, especially in the fuller. This is a very rough finish here. I know he is limited to what grit sandpaper he has available to him, but I think he has recently acquired some higher grit sandpaper, so I hope to see some better finish coming out of him. And the last thing for Purna, it would be nice to see him learn and implement how to seat the blade in the crossguard with the little ledge inside the gap for the shoulders of the blade to rest on. Let's talk bottom line. If you wanted to commission a version of this sword, it would probably run you around $900 to $1,000. What do you get for that price? Well, you get a wickedly sharp sword that is a really cool design that evokes an F3E falchion that can be used two-handed, while also evoking a lot of handling characteristics of a katana. That's a pretty unique blend. You get a sword that is a lot of fun to move around, has a good amount of authority in the cut without feeling point heavy, and a sword that cuts tatami very well, cuts water bottles exceptionally well. It doesn't cut pool noodles very well, but that's probably the least fun target to cut anyway, so I'm okay with that. Unfortunately, it's also possible that you'll get a sword with suspect heat treatment. Again, I don't think this one has that problem, but the two that Philip Martin received were absolutely not heat treated properly or tempered properly. Something was wrong with them. And it is just unacceptable at any price point to have what is supposed to be a functional sword not have a proper heat treatment. You know, you can look at the $100, $200 budget range. You can look at the $60, $50 katanas you can get on Amazon. I expect all of them to have a proper heat treat. To have a sword in this price range be not reliable in the heat treatment is just completely unacceptable. So while I think the design of this sword by the Levin Lance is an absolute home run, I love pretty much almost everything about this sword's design. The little nitpicks that I said are exactly that, nitpicks. The design is outstanding, and I think it is well worth looking into having something like this made. But I can't recommend Purna. It breaks my heart to say that because, again, I really like Purna. I really like what he does. I like his work, and I want him to be a great option for people. But until he figures out what's going on with causing these swords that are being sent to Philip and not being properly hardened, I can't recommend anybody spend almost $1,000 on a sword from him. Honestly, I couldn't recommend commissioning a sword for him at half that price. It's just not acceptable for a sword to not be properly heat treated, and it's just such a shame. And that's going to wrap up this review. A huge thank you to my friend Nate, the Levin Lance, for loaning me this sword. I encourage you to go to his YouTube channel and check out his videos. He mostly does little showcases of the different swords and weapons that he has designed, and he's done a lot of them, and they are all very cool. And of course, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, all the things that YouTube likes to see to drive engagement and share the video more and help the channel to continue to grow. Until next time, Alien Toot out.